Welcome to Currents Up Close, and another in a series of programs about education in the Cedar Falls area. And it's my pleasure today to welcome our guest, Superintendent Andy Pattee, and Director of Business Affairs, Doug Nefsker. Welcome to the program today. And we're going to talk about school finance today, which really you would say in this time of the year, why are we talking about school finance? And it's so critical to every district in the state of Iowa and to every student enrolled in their particular districts. And it's so timely that I just picked out a couple of articles from the Des Moines Register within the last week. School funding fight gains steam as we prepare for the legislative session for 2016. And of course, an opinion article which just appeared recently in the Des Moines Register. School funding, K-12 school funding with a broken pencil, and saying a broken illegal process that betrays children. Now, we won't get into all the rationale, what that means, but we'll simply start out by saying it's very critical. And the timing is right now as you plan and prepare for the next school year. And based on what's happened previously, you've got a lot of things that you have to address and that the district has to address. People that probably don't see those things on the surface, it's not out in front, but it's very, very critical for the success of our teachers, our staff, and ultimately the students receiving a quality education in our district. So with that, I would like to start right out, and Andy, let's get rolling here with Iowa Public School finance. That's a topic that probably we can narrow it down and say, how does it really impact us and the students in Cedar Falls?
Exactly. In school finance, school funding is really a complicated process, and it's really different than a lot of other entities across the state, across the country. One of the slides that we have here talks a little bit about how school finance is operated and the legal basis for that school operation. When you look across the country, cities, counties in the state of Iowa, us as individual people live off of what's called home rule, that we can purchase anything with our funds that is not expressly illegal in Iowa code. For instance, we can go out and buy a new pair of pants if we want to as a homeowner, as an individual in Iowa. We can go out as a city to purchase a snowplow because that's authorized. Schools operate in a different way. We operate underneath Dillon's rule, and that means we cannot purchase items unless it's authorized specifically that we can purchase that item in Iowa code. And that happens with a lot of our categorical funding, with a lot of our silos in education. In education, if you can't spend funds that's not expressly authorized in Iowa code, you're not allowed to spend your money on those items. So it's very limiting, it's very confining, and it's very, very specific because of Dillon's rule.
Well, and everything is based really, it comes right down to it on student enrollment. And as you talk about those funds that come into the district, Doug, from a Business Director Affairs office, you have to work closely with the entire enrollment figures, and we've got a couple of slides here that talk about the budget impact on student enrollment.
The number of students that we enroll each year as of the 1st of October, that's our certified head count date. And based on those number of students, that determines our school budget authority for the subsequent or following school year, and gives us our revenue stream for that school year as well. You can see on the graph that is on the screen. The blue bar represents our certified enrollment. Red bar is the actual students within our school district at the desks. And then the green bar indicates our projected future enrollment with the student enrollment demographic studies that we've had done recently. And you can see that the Cedar Falls School District has lost some students over a period of time. But and since about 2000, we've started growing back at a fairly rapid clip, and we're going to continue to grow at a fairly rapid clip through the next 8 or 10 years or so.
And Dr. Paty, you just announced the certified student enrollment,
Correct.
and there was an increase this year of approximately how many, not approximately, but an exact number of how many students?
144 students, which is
144
very exciting.
students.
As you see by that chart, we are growing, and the anticipated growth into the future shows a very positive trend line. There's a lot of districts across the state, as well as regionally, that are not growing, and you're in a much better shape because your funding is based on the number of students that you have in your district. So with more students comes more funding, which allows us to have more programs and more opportunities for students.
And that allows, meaning takes us into allowable growth. Just
Yes.
what is that term, allowable growth, and how does it impact your planning for the budget?
Yeah, allowable growth is an interesting concept, and it's unique to the state of Iowa within the funding. And I think there's a slide as well that shows kind of the term allowable growth. And this is the state percentage of growth that the state legislature sets on an annual basis. And that allowable growth, now called supplemental state aid, is a percentage that is added each year to the cost per student, which is a misnomer. It's not a cost per student, but it's amount that is generated per student across the state. And you take that number times the number of students that you have, and that generates your baseline funding that you receive as a school district that you can spend for programming in your school district.
And here is our allowable growth rate history, and just looking at those figures quickly here, Doug Nefsker, explain that a little bit, how those fluctuations occur and the impact.
Well, it becomes very difficult from a budgeting process to be able to sit down and develop a budget for a school year. First, without knowing what your revenue stream is going to be, because we're all based on that. And then with the last few years, it's also been the additional impact of the legislature not being able to come to an agreement on what that supplemental state aid amount would be until extremely late in the session. All Iowa schools across the state are required to certify their budgets by April 15th. And without having any indication from the legislature what those dollars are going to be for subsequent school years, does make it very difficult for us to be able to accurately and adequately plan for our students' needs for the subsequent school year.
And Dr. Paty, that happened just this past summer, I should say at the end of the legislative session, and kind of review that a little bit of what resulted from the action there, or inaction, at the state level.
Right. We had to make some assumptions within our budgeting process this past year because the legislature did not pass the allowable growth or the supplemental state aid until late in the session. And in fact, we started the new fiscal year not knowing what actually our budget numbers would be because of the veto by the governor, which happened at the first week in July, I believe, right before July 4th. So we had quite a few unknowns moving into this fiscal year, which is very, very challenging as a school district, as you look to plan, as you look to ensure the programs are in place for that school year as well into the future. And I think if you go back to that slide with the allowable growth, you can see since 2010, there's not been a lot of consistency with allowable growth. It's really bumped up and down. And historically, we have actually fallen behind some of the inflationary rates. And even if you're a growing district like Cedar Falls is, we are still trying to catch up with the ongoing increases of heating and cooling our buildings, the ongoing increases of running our buses and fuel costs, trying to make sure that we are keeping up with the cost of health care and those other expenses. So we have been in some really difficult positions, especially with the late funding, but also the inadequacy of some of the funding for student learning and programs.
We have a kind of an interesting slide following up on that with per pupil ranking nationally, and I think we can look at that right now. And I know you can obviously center in on the green in the middle, but tell us a little bit about that. How does that rank up here? And this was for the actual 2013-14 school year.
Exactly, and this is from the National Education Association, and this ranks the per pupil spending for each student in each state. And interestingly enough, we are 35th in the nation for per pupil spending in the state of Iowa. And you look at a lot of our surrounding school or states, they spend more than we do per student. And that's something we really have to be attuned to understand that typically if you are not funding education adequately or appropriately, programs get lost. And you have heard from, I think in the news the last several years, local school districts making reductions, and a lot of those reductions are in some of those non-core areas that are so essential to educating the whole child, to ensuring that each child has that opportunity to be involved with the arts and to be able to have more cultural opportunities. And if you continue to fund us as a state in that 35th in really that lower half of states across the nation, there are some choices that are going to have to be made by districts.
And then we have some interesting slides here, Doug, on our per student spending in a comparative basis. We have two slides that they're very, this will be reduced a little bit on the next slide, but talk a little bit about that, Doug.
Well, what you're seeing here is a rank since 2008 of funding changes across the nation. And you'll note that Iowa has experienced an approximate 11.7% change in student cost per funding. That's in a negative 11.7% based on an inflation-adjusted factor. So we are currently 35th, and we're running obviously a little bit less. We're slipping down that ladder a little bit towards amount per child being spent across the nation. That affects us in so many different ways. I think we have a graph or a slide that'll be coming up that talks about where our dollars are spent. School districts across Iowa and across the nation are basically very labor-intensive organizations. We're not a manufacturing plant or anything that's producing an end product. Our costs are associated with employees that benefit our students. And so typically you'll see a school district in at 80 to 85% of their total budget in any one school year that'll be directly associated with labor costs. And that's just the nature of the beast. And when you don't have the adequate funding associated with that, it doesn't allow us to have those appropriate individuals and instructors in place to meet the needs of students in those particular programmings, whether it be core area or otherwise.
And that slide is a very interesting slide, because the target of that slide is really to look at what happened since the recession. You know, the recession that took place in 2008, which affected really the whole country and certainly the international and whole world. But Iowa right now, there are only 10 states that have actually reduced more in state spending, and this is inflation adjusted, in Iowa. And you can look at those states and where they're at. But 11.7 decrease since 2008 in per pupil expenditure is really a large number when you look at then how do we continue those programs, how do we continue to fund our students appropriately to get the education that's necessary.
Well, there are so many factors that Doug has referenced here, as well as you, Andy, that we're going to take a look at in the second portion of the program, you know, with such things as general fund expenditures and property tax rate history and things like that, that may not be the most exciting thing to discuss, but they're very important. Yes. As we deliver that educational program for our students. So we'll return after the break and continue our discussion on school finance.
Thank you.
Pretty much a good day for me would be people leaving their hands off of me. I'm always called names. Everywhere that I go, there's always someone calling me names, calling me gay. I've been choked, thrown up against a wall, punched. Nobody's ever tried to help me.
Hi, may I please have an application? Thank you.
Skip the drama. Get your diploma.
Good.
Take that first step towards a better future. Find free adult education classes at finishyourdiploma.org.
As a parent, I think it's tragic that 1 in 5 children struggles with hunger right here in America. But there is hope. Visit feedingamerica.org to help. Together we can solve hunger. Together, we're Feeding America.
Welcome back to Currents Up Close, and a program on education in the Cedar Falls Community School District, and of course reintroduce Superintendent Andy Pattee and Director of Business Affairs Doug Nefsker. Been talking about school finance the first half and how these things all come together from the state level and taxing authority and per pupil figures and enrollment, and all that comes down to the kinds of things that we're going to talk about the second half of. How really is that divided up? So, Doug, I think we have a pie chart here, and let's talk a little bit about that on the general fund expenditures. We talked in the first half about generating the revenue, and now let's talk a little bit about expenditures and how that is determined.
Thank you. We briefly touched about this in the first half of the show today. Typically, an Iowa school district is very heavily labor intensive. That's not unique across the entire country. And you can see for Cedar Falls for the 2014-15 school year, we were approximately 84% of our total costs were directly tied to salary and benefits. Not unusual. Most school districts are in that 80 to 85% range, so Cedar Falls is pretty typical for a school district in the state of Iowa. And you'll see the other parts of the pie graph over there on the right. The AEA flow-through, that is dollars that flow through the Cedar Falls School District directly to our local area education agency. All school districts across the state of Iowa are required to do that. And so that's just a part of it. You build that into your budget, but we actually never are able to use those dollars. Supplies are pretty much self-explanatory, as well as equipment and miscellaneous. And then the purchase services, that's sort of a ambiguous type category, and we basically are using that for tuition, nursing services, printing technology, and we do have a very small amount of non-public services. By legislative statute, we're required to reimburse the non-publics for a small amount for textbooks, for transportation to and from school, and those sorts of things. So in a big piece of the puzzle, you can kind of see where our dollars all go.
And really, when you look at the enrollment increase compared to the enrollment decline, as you mentioned earlier in the program, if there's a significant drop in enrollment, then you have to get that budget to fit, and you're going to turn to those 84% of personnel costs to one degree or another, because you can only do so much with that 16%. So as you grow then, as you increase enrollment, you again have to say, how many staff are we going to need for this this increase in enrollment? And it won't come for another year, probably. So that really is the importance of your planning in ahead.
So crucial, because funding is always 1 year in arrears. So our certified enrollment that just took place October 1st of this year, we won't see the funding for those 144 additional students until next year. So the planning component is so extremely important. So we know what the supplemental state aid is. We know what that percentage is. That's supposed to be set a full calendar year in advance. In recent years, that's been set usually in the spring of the current year, which always puts us behind the planning process to ensure that we're providing the right programs, having the right staff in place to ensure that we're serving our kids at that excellence range that we expect in Cedar Falls. Back to your question, that's so crucial. If you are losing students, there's really one big part of the pie that you always have to go back and look at, and that's staff. If you're growing students, then you continue to have to look at that staff to find out, are you having the right programs, the right class size ratios as you add staff. And in Cedar Falls, we added 3 new teachers this year in August due to our growing enrollment, which is a great challenge, but then it also goes back to space and making sure you have the right facilities.
Great. Well, that brings us up to how are these funds generated? What's the history of the property tax? And we know that's a major factor, and we might want to get into a little bit of how the state has changed with their commitment to local districts. It's not understood by a lot of people, but it really brings it back to the local district. So let's have a discussion on that, and we've got some charts as well too. But just give us a little background on that and how that works.
Well, you can see on the screen what we've shown today is our total tax rate per thousand for the general fund, which is our general operating fund that's within the school district. That's where all the teacher salaries and benefits, all the employee benefits are paid for. General operating costs and everything. The previous pie chart that we showed is basically the general fund. And then you'll also see the management fund. That's the little red bar. Those are, it's a categorical or specific use type fund where we can only pay for insurance benefits, not employee insurance benefits, but property, auto, liability, that sort of thing. And then the PEPAL fund is the physical plant and equipment levy. The district has been fortunate enough to have that fund, and the community has supported that for a number of years. And we use that for a variety of things to include the repairs of buildings, purchasing equipment. More and more we're using that for technology, as our technology needs throughout the district have continued to grow. And so those are basically the 3 funds. Debt service is the other one, but the school district does not have any debt service at this time. Any debt that we have is all paid through our 1 cent local option sales tax revenues. So you can see over the last half a dozen years or so, we've been able to continue to slowly reduce our property tax asking on a per thousand basis situation, and we're proud of that. We've got some graphs that'll talk about where we rank in the top 25 school districts in size across the state, and there you can see that right there. We always compare ourselves to our neighbors, and when you compare us to the 25 largest school districts across the state, this would be for the 2014-15 school year. Cedar Falls had the lowest tax rate of those 25 largest school districts by population across the state. And that's broken down by general fund rate, management, PEPAL, and all of that to break it all down to show the total rate.
I might add the PEPAL, when you mentioned we've had it for a number of years. I think we've had it for 80 plus years.
Correct.
I think there have been referendums on that every 10 years. I think it still is
That's
the same
correct.
case. And so, not that I've been here all the 80 years, but it's close to it. But that's been a significant factor, and you mentioned about many ways it can be expended, those dollars with that.
And we're really leveraging those PEPAL dollars with technology in particular as we've been moving into the one-on-one initiative across the district. And we would not be able to have accomplished what we've been able to accomplish in the last few years without those physical plant equipment levy dollars.
And I think what's really interesting about that graph is you look at the last 6 years, obviously our tax levy rate has decreased over those last 6 years. At the same time, the state has really been shifting some of the burden and relieving some of the local property tax rates as well with corporate different rules and regulations that they've imposed the last several years. And picked up some more of the cost at the statewide level. So, you know, we've been trying to balance some of the rollbacks and some of the new code requirements that have come in, as well as trying to ensure that we're being fiscally responsible and lowering that levy rate. So there's a lot of factors at play. There's a lot of discussion that has to take place, and a lot of fiscal management that we're responsible for, and really a testament to Doug and the school board, because they do a tremendous job ensuring fiscal management and ensuring that we are strong fiscal managers as we look at how do we expend taxpayer dollars.
There's a danger in asking a question like this, because I don't know if you've got the answer, but as that has been reduced, is there a percentage you could put on that, Andy, that of the state commitment towards the funding of schools compared to the property tax? In that period of time, how much has that shifted? Is it like 60 to 50%, or it's hard to determine exactly, but a round figure. I think people would need to understand that there has been a shift in just what you've been talking about.
That's exactly right.
That'd be a hard question to answer, but what I can tell you is over the last half a dozen years or so, the rollback, which in real simplistic terms means what your total assessed valuation of a piece of property is on a residential level, and then it rolls back down to the actual taxable assessed valuation. That number has been growing, so an individual property, residential property tax owner, the amount that they're paying taxes on is incrementally moving up. At the same time, a few years ago, the legislature and the governor approved a commercial industrial rollback, and so that's been slowly being implemented and being put into place. Now the state of Iowa is backfilling those dollars with state aid, but that is scheduled to run out in another year, if my memory serves me correctly. So we're not quite sure what that impact will be for us in future.
Will there have to be
school
decisions
years.
made at that level, at the legislative level?
They could potentially be, or they could potentially choose not to do that, and then that would just sort of fade off into the sunset, and then it would be up to the local property taxing entity to deal with that. Now that's not just a school district concern, but it would be any municipality across the state of Iowa that would have
Anyone
the
that's
same
receiving
issue.
those tax dollars.
There's been a lot of discussion from cities and counties about the very same thing, that once that agreement goes away, that they would backfill those dollars, which goes away very quickly. What happens with that gap? And certainly that's a gap that needs to be explored and discussed, because that's fairly significant when you look at the business and industry, that commercial rollback. And again, I think a lot of people across the state support the rollback. It's a great opportunity to increase business and industry across the state, but there are some taxing implications and funding implications that go along with that.
And I would echo that too. I think the whole thing from my perspective is that continuity and how we can continue to budget and move forward with knowing what our assessed valuations are and what revenue stream is going to be, so that we can meet the needs of kids.
We could probably have another program on this next topic here. We've got to get back to a slide or two before we finish. But the idea that the state, when they're increasing the funding for education, so many times it's an identified area.
Yes.
It's not in a general fund kind of thing. Example might be the teacher program that
Teacher leadership compensation.
not going directly to your budget, but it's going into a specific area. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, there are a number of categorical funds, as what they're called, that are given to us either whether it be state or at the federal level, and those are very specific. The teacher leadership compensation funding, which the Cedar Falls School District will receive beginning next school year. That's very specific as to how the district can spend those dollars. We're currently receiving teacher salary supplement dollars. Those, of course, have to go directly towards salary compensation for our instructional teaching staff. There are federal Title I dollars that are used for very specific programming, and those are all categoricals that the school board and the administration don't necessarily have the flexibility they need to have to use those dollars.
Okay, we've got one more slide that we want to take a look at here, and that is the continuous district comparison. Without spending a lot of time on this, maybe one or two of you could talk, or both of you talk about that, this chart right here.
And again, just a quick conversation about this. This just shows our contiguous districts, and again, our tax levy rate this last fiscal year was $12.78 per $1,000, and you can see where that ranks with our contiguous districts, and very excited about that slide.
We have one additional slide, and that's a summary and wrap-up of our program today, and let's talk a little bit about that. Quickly, you might want to review that.
Big picture, enrollment matters. Enrollment drives the funding and what we receive, so you can see what the other components are that we talked about, and very important that school finance and the impact it has locally.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Andy Pattee, Superintendent of Schools, and Doug Nestor, Director of Business Affairs, for this program on school finance. And they can contact either one of you, or both,
Yep.
Yes.
if they would want additional information on this topic.